Appius Claudius Pulcher, Consul 54 BCE, Censor 50 BCE. Politicians bearing the name Appius Claudius Pulcher were more or less guaranteed to become consuls and exercise great influence in the Roman Senate. The name had been associated with preening arrogance ever since the Sabine leader Appius Claudius defected to Rome with his retainers. However, no Appius Claudius Pulcher was haughtier than the Consul of 54. In fact, he was so abrasive that Cicero created a neologism, appietas, to describe the man's excessive self-regard. Appius may have overestimated his importance and ability, but even his detractors admitted that he was intelligent and learned, particularly on matters of religion. In an era with skeptical thinkers such as Cicero and Lucretius, Appius was well known for the sincerity of his superstition. The eldest son of the Consul of 79, Appius enjoyed a close relationship, personal and political, with all 5 of his younger siblings. His youngest brother, Appius Claudius Pulcher, was one of the most important figures of the 50s, not to mention a figure of immense controversy. His sister, Claudia Metelli, was one of the most famous women in Roman history. Yet, arguably, neither of them are objectively more important than Appius. When the first Triumvirate formed, Appius agreed to help them and offered up the services of his 2 brothers in addition. After his consulship, Appius underwent the trauma of seeing one brother killed and the other disgraced, which led to a sudden change in his politics. Gone was the lover of luxury, and newly arrived was a patrician attempting to invoke the old-time morality of his forefathers, although his careful fault-finding was very strictly partisan in nature. During the final crisis between Caesar and Pompey, Appius was one of the loudest voices against the negotiated settlement. Once established in Greece with Pompey, Appius began to govern Achaea, but would end up seeing no action in the Great Civil War, as he died soon after receiving an ambiguously worded response from the Delphic oracle. Although it is a relatively subjective statement, it's one I'm willing to stand by. Gens Claudia was the most dominant family within the Roman Republic. No family was more consistently successful at attaining the consulship every generation than the Claudii. And of all the various branches of the family, the one that was by far the most prominent by the late Republic, maybe even by the Middle Republic, was the Claudii Pulchri. And the most famous first name in the family was, of course, Appius, which was more or less exclusive to the family since it was an import from the Sabines, the original being Audius. As for Appius's early life, he was the grandson of a famous consul from the late 2nd century who had been the father-in-law of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and had played a big role in the Gracchian reforms. So he had some, I guess we could call it, popularis credibility. But then his father, the Consul of 79, had been a staunch Solon. So Appius and his 2 brothers had the option of going any direction they wanted in politics, and indeed Appius would very much take both directions at various times in his career. Speaking of his brothers, Appius was the eldest of 6 children. He had 3 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers. Gaius was a year younger, and then Appius Claudius Pulcher was born in 92, which makes him 5 years younger than Appius. As for the sisters, their birth order and exact ages are debated. There are even a few scholars who think that his most famous sister, Claudia, was born before him, and possibly by a different mother. At any rate, though, most likely they were stair-step children, starting with Appius and ending with Publius. But all of them were close throughout their lives. They never had any serious beef, so far as we know. And they were possibly bonded a bit by the fact that their father died early. He died while being the proconsular governor of Macedonia in 76, and that made our Appius the paterfamilias at age 19. Sometimes people have tried to make it out like it was a grand tragedy or a real imposition on the family, but we have to remember ancient standards for not only life expectancy, but also what constituted an adult. And certainly by age 19, Appius would be expected to be able to fulfill that role and do it with competence. Overall, it seems like he very much did that, by the way. He didn't have any trouble stepping up and becoming the head of his household. Up until at least the 1990s, if not the 2000s, most scholars who looked into Appius's generation of Claudii assumed that they had grown up broke. And this is based upon a passage in Marcus Terentius Varro's De Re Rustica, which is a work on agriculture. Appius is one of the speakers in it, and he's asked about how hard it was when he first became paterfamilias as his family was broke. He talked about having trouble paying dowries and only being able to serve honeyed wine to visitors. However, based on everything else we know about Appius and his siblings, it appears that it was in fact a joke. So that is the current scholarly consensus, the idea being that there was no financial interruption just because the elder Appius died. Certainly we know that Appius and all of his siblings were known for their love of luxury, and none of the three brothers ever struggled to find funding to run for office, which was an incredibly expensive undertaking. If there was any interruption at all, it would have probably just been maybe it took a little bit of time to settle the estate, and so maybe there had to be a delay with one or two of the dowries. But ultimately, this was a non-issue, and so I think the scholars who are saying that it was simply a joke are correct. Otherwise, it would have taken Appius some time to dig himself out of the hole, and we see no evidence that he ever had a down period, or that his sisters ever went without the greatest fashions that were available at the time. By today's standards, all of the Roman senators would be considered arrogant braggarts, and among those arrogant braggarts, none were more outstandingly proud of themselves than the patricians. And of the patricians, no family was more notoriously self-aggrandizing than the Claudii Pulcheri. And of the Claudii Pulcheri, no one was more arrogant than Appius Claudius Pulcher, the Consul of 54. In fact, he was so breathtakingly arrogant that Cicero actually invented a word to describe his level of self-regard, and that word was appietas. Pietas, of course, being the Latin term for regard for one's father or for one's ancestors or the gods. Piety, in other words. So the joke, of course, is that his piety is for people named Appius, and that alone. Apparently this term seems to have maybe taken off at least in Cicero's circle. That being said, although Appius did sometimes piss people off with his hauteur, he did have positive attributes as well. He was not without his charm. In Varro's De Re Rustica, for instance, he does make some jokes, and he shows that he has a sense of humor. He could be witty. He was very learned, so he would be someone you could discuss philosophy with, or religion, or the law. That being said, he was known for having a very serious side, and so most conversations with him would be in earnest. Because when he spoke about religion, he's someone who believed every last detail of Roman religion. Cicero was skeptical. He believed that the gods were real, but he wasn't sure about every single ceremony or every single tradition. Then there were some like Lucretius who were more atheistic in nature, but Appius was very much a believer in the whole shebang. And in Roman religion, by the way, as long as your practice was correct, it actually didn't matter what you believed. And so Appius, although he was probably aware that Cicero and others were not as deeply religious as he would not necessarily think that they were incapable of performing the rites the correct way. So, if you wanted someone to talk to on matters of religion, Appius Claudius Pulcher would be a good guy to go to, because he's obsessed with these things and could tell you quite a bit. And he, as long as his personal pride is not involved, was not necessarily the worst company you could encounter. Just don't stay for too long, or otherwise you're going to get a family history lesson on why the Claudii are inherently superior to everyone else in the world. If you followed my videos long enough, you know that I'm a big fan of Stephen Saylor's historical novels about Rome. And one of the things that Saylor often speculates on is that Publius Claudius Pulcher and Clodia thought that Appius was a bore and that there was some tension in the family. However, when we look at the primary sources, such as they are, we see no evidence of that. It appears that all of the siblings were always in harmony with one another, and they also had a number of close cousins who were also permanent political allies, and Of this whole group of 9 or 10 people, the leader, without a doubt, was Appius Claudius Pulcher. He was the one who set the tone, and the others obeyed him. He had a brother who was a year younger, Gaius Claudius Pulcher. He would follow in his brother's footsteps and take his marching orders from Appius. In return, Appius would always back him. As for the youngest brother, Publius Claudius Pulcher, the one who made the most noise, he actually had Appius's endorsement when he arranged for himself to be adopted in the plebeian family so he could serve as a tribune and help out the Triumvirate. So one would think that given his immense pride in his patrician heritage that Appius might have had a problem with it, and Saylor's supposition on that account is understandable, but what little evidence we actually have shows that Appius was there during the adoption ceremony and he was giving Publius his full endorsement. So, if anything, Appius was on board with the idea from the outset and may have even pledged such a deal to Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus as part of him joining with the first triumvirate, which we'll get to in a minute. So, Appius is not only a politician in his own right, but he effectively has the loyalty of his 2 brothers and then a couple of his cousins as well. So he was a minor power broker on that count, but if we think about the quality and the name recognition that he brings to the table with his brothers, he actually is bringing a whole block into the larger block that is the Triumvirate. Prior to their election to the Senate, most young Romans who had political ambitions had to settle for being military tribunes, but Appius Claudius Pulcher, by the time he was in his mid-20s, was able to snag a position as a legate. And the reason he was able to do this is because he was serving alongside of his brother-in-law, Lucius Licinius Lucullus. This was in connection with the Third Mithridatic War, which was mostly waged by Lucullus, and then famously, of course, would be taken over by Pompey. We only see Appius in action once, and that is when he travels to the court of Tigranes of Armenia. His mission was to demand that Tigranes hand over Mithridates VI of Pontus, his son-in-law. We don't know a lot of details about the mission, such as how open Tigranes actually was to helping out the Romans. We do get the impression from the sources that he was very much looking out for his own interest, and that he was open to stabbing Mithridates in the back and making a peace with Rome. However, it appears that not only did Appius fail in his mission, which might not have been his fault, Tigranes might have had other considerations in mind, but certainly we end up with the impression that some of the failure was due to Appius's behavior, that even at the court of a king, in the presence of yet another king, Appius was the guy who seemed like he had the biggest ego, despite the fact that at this point he was maybe 25 years old and really hadn't done a whole lot. So, it appears that Appius and his famous arrogance did not play very well in diplomacy, even when he was being a diplomat to kings, men who were used to over-the-top levels of arrogance. It's, of course, possible, too, that some of this is simply to drive the narrative about Appius's arrogance. We really can't say. Suffice it to say, though, Appius will never be much of a diplomat on Rome's behalf, although we'll see that later he does do some successful negotiating with other Romans. So my suspicion is either that he improved over time, or that the account of his failure in Armenia was a little bit exaggerated just to help drive home the narrative that he is, in fact, far too arrogant. If you were to ask for a one-sentence summary of Appius Claudius Pulcher's political alignment, it would be that he was a major advocate of the boni, the good men. And certainly he began his career that way. Lucius Lucullus was one of the golden boys of Sulla, and he was in many ways the most prestigious of Sulla's successors other than Pompey. Then, later on, of course, Appius will have his conservative turn that we'll get into. And so that is what he's best known for. But if we divide his career by time, actually half of his career was spent with the Triumvirate, as an ally of Caesar and Pompey and Crassus. So Appius was very much on both sides of the partisan divide of his time. In fact, he was one of the earliest adherents of the First Triumvirate. When they first formed in late 60, going into 59, Appius Claudius Pulcher seems to have attended a meeting with them and not only pledged his support, but that of his two brothers Gaius and Publius. Then famously, during Caesar's consulship in 59, Publius was adopted as a plebeian, and as we mentioned, Appius had no issues with that. Now Cato, of course, did, but Appius was fine with it. And then Publius went on to be tribune. He was able to get a number of laws passed for the Triumvirs. He then also turned a little bit traitor on them, but we'll get into that in a minute. And so, Appius was a major power player, and his ideology, at least in this middle portion of his career, was incredibly flexible. So, although he's today remembered as one of the hardcore conservatives, he was only hardcore when it suited him. And he could be rather more flexible than his superstition and his overweening pride in his heritage might seem to imply. Given Appius's original political affiliation and then where he ended up by the end of his life, it might come as a surprise to know that in the mid-50s, Appius was a deeply hated figure among the adherents of the Bani. Not only had he turned traitor, but he had unleashed his younger brother upon the good citizens of Rome. Publius had started a gang and was terrorizing many of the better people in Rome. Better, of course, being defined by the wealthy people who always called themselves the better sort, or the Bani, the good men, the Optimates, the best men. And in fact, we'll see that at a funeral, which was a mostly exclusive gathering held by Metellus Scipio in 57, Appius would make a splash, and not in a good way. He showed up in his capacity as praetor, and he was actually booed by the audience. In fact, the audience's reaction to Appius's arrival was so negative that Appius took a rather roundabout way to get to his seat to make sure that no one attacked him or threw something at him. Cicero famously called this in his letters the Appian Way, as a joke about how this Appius Claudius Pulcher also had his own route. Of course, for those of you who don't get it, the Appian Way was the most famous thoroughfare leading into Rome, and it was built by one of Appius's direct ancestors. So, Appius at this period was somewhat popular among the common people, but he had some real enemies among wealthy citizens and his fellow senators, which would have made a lot of social gatherings rather awkward. This may very well not be the only time that something like this occurred. Earlier, I expressed some skepticism about Appius being such a poor diplomat in Armenia that he single-handedly sank the negotiations between Lucullus and Tigranes. And the reason why I'm skeptical that Appius was the worst diplomat of all time is because he was frequently employed as someone who would help to patch up relations between the members of the First Triumvirate. Crassus and Pompey had long despised each other before the formation of the Triumvirate, and there was also tension, I believe, between Pompey and Caesar. And this started to crop up by the winter of 57 to 56. A lot of this was due to the increasingly independent-minded and roguish activity of Publius. And so Appius met with them that winter to help patch things up temporarily. Then he went off to his governorship in Sardinia, where he was the pro-Praetorian governor. This was rather uneventful. Luckily for Appius, he didn't catch malaria, which was the big danger of going to Sardinia. In his absence, things got worse as Clodius and his gangs started to target Pompey. In fact, Pompey had trouble leaving his home and entering the city because Clodius and his gang made life miserable for him. And then this led to Pompey believing that Clodius might be acting on the orders of Caesar or Crassus. So when Appius came back from Sardinia, one of his first priorities was to make sure that everything was cool between his family and the Triumvirs, especially with Pompey. And we have to remember that there was some existing animosity between the Claudians and Pompey because Lucullus was the brother-in-law of Appius and Publius, and Lucullus had famously lost his command against Mithridates to Pompey. So perhaps Publius was going after him in that connection. Well, Appius now came in 55 and put an end to all that. He arranged for his daughter to marry Pompey's eldest son, Gnaeus Pompeius. He also forbade Clodius from continuing to go after Pompey, and it appears that despite Claudius supposedly being this wild man, he obeyed his elder brother. And so, this has led at least one person to speculate that all of the pressure that Claudius put on Pompey was a negotiating tactic by the family as a whole, that they wanted to create a problem that they could then solve to enhance their standing within the First Triumvirate. But it's hard to say. Certainly it is interesting, though, that Appius played a much bigger role in the resolution of all of this than I think almost any accounts of Roman politics from this period, except the most detailed accounts like Arthur Kahn's account, are really willing to get into. In 54, Appius was elected consul alongside of the plebeian Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Later, they would be close allies in the struggle to cause war with Caesar, but for now they were enemies, because actually Appius was still an ally of Caesar, whereas Domitius was already a committed opponent, one of the most outspoken, in fact. In his commentaries, Caesar just calls Domitius an opponent or an enemy of Caesar, so that enmity was well known and very public, and Domitius didn't really care if anyone knew how personal it was. So this meant the two consuls would clash frequently over that. However, most of what Appius's time as consul was known for was him trying to advance the interest of his family. His brother, being a year younger, would be eligible for the consulship the following year, and so what Appius was trying to do is to make sure that there was a clear path for Gaius. So what he did was he used his contacts in Sardinia to make a trumped-up case against one of the other candidates who had also served in Sardinia as governor, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. Appius and his brother knew that now that a patrician was not guaranteed to have a spot, that you would need to knock out at least the other patrician candidate to get one of the two slots. And so they tried to weaken Scaurus, and Appius launched an attack, a lawsuit. In the meantime, though, Gaius was out governing Macedonia, and he apparently didn't think that he could compete in such a crowded field, since it was shaping up to be a very competitive four-way race where all four candidates were about equally strong. So even after Appius went out and started the whole lawsuit, Gaius then wrote him a letter and said, actually, I'm going to stay another year in Macedonia, so don't worry about me, I'll sit this one out. One wonders if Appius might have been a bit miffed that his brother put his efforts to waste. At any rate, though, there would still be a lot of controversy surrounding this election, and even though he didn't have a horse in the race, or so everyone thought, Appius would still manage to be at the center of this great controversy, the thing we might call the scandal of scandals of an era that was ridden with scandals. Even though neither Appius nor Domitius were known for their easygoing personalities, and they no doubt clashed over the issue of Caesar on multiple occasions, they did find the ability to get along with one another for long enough to engage in one of the greatest political scandals in the history of the Roman Republic. As I mentioned earlier, there was a four-way race for consul, and so far as everyone knew, it was a virtual tie. There was no daylight between any of the four candidates. If anything, the leading candidate, if there was one, would have been Gaius Memmius, simply because he had the endorsement of Caesar, and that meant a large amount of money, and also Caesar's men showing up to vote. But Memmius did not feel that confident. All of the candidates would be pouring their hearts and souls into this campaign, and anyone who lost would be incurring a great deal of debt that they would have trouble repaying. Memmius, therefore, decided to create double insurance. He already had one running mate, who had been endorsed by Caesar as well, but what he decided to do was to make a side bet. So he approached the two sitting consuls, Appius and Domitius, and had a secret running mate, and then the idea was the two consuls would back that ticket. And so, the pledge that the two candidates, Memmius and the other one, made to the two sitting consuls was that if they lost, they would pay the consuls for their aid. So they would have to incur a lot of debt. However, if they were victorious in the election, they would do an even greater favor for Appius and Domitius. They would do everything in their power to make sure that the Senate granted them very good proconsular governorships, which would be profitable and potentially glorious. And so, they not only made this agreement with handshakes, but they actually put it in writing. And so, rumors quickly started to circulate as soon as they had signed this agreement. It was all highly illegal, by the way, and the Roman people felt like this was a dirty bargain. Now, they didn't know the details, and they also didn't know for sure if it was real, but certainly rumors had been circulating. In fact, things were so bad that there was public tumult, and this delayed the election by a few months. So the election was supposed to be held in the summer of 54 for the consulships of 53, but instead it was now September, and things were not calm enough to hold the election. Finally, Pompey sort of approached Memmius and said, "What's going on, Memmius? Can you reveal it?" And Memmius, for whatever reason, agreed to spill the beans. Perhaps he thought that if he exposed the plot that he created, that this would somehow make it all better. But anyway, he went before the Roman Senate and laid out the deal. He also, of course, produced a document with Appius' signature on it, as well as that of Domitius. This created a firestorm in Roman politics and literally shut down the Republic as a functioning government for months on end. Cicero did note sardonically, of course, that while there were plenty of people that could have been disappointed by the conduct of, say, Memmius or Domitius, no one really thought anything of Appius' participation in this, because Appius was a piece of shit. While a number of politicians did things to try to cover up their involvement in the scandal, Appius made no effort to deny it, and he offered no apologies. He also was not prosecuted for it. So, without ever issuing any kind of apology or admitting that he had engaged in any wrongdoing, he now set off for his proconsular governorship in Cilicia. This was an area that was not all that wealthy, but it did have opportunities for graft and also for some warfare. At the time that he entered Cilicia, it was actually somewhat pacified. But after 2 years of Appius, that would no longer be the case. Once he got there, Appius and his legates began to shamelessly shake down the locals. And in fact, he embarked upon a campaign of self-enrichment that would turn the province from peaceful to warlike within a couple of years. At the end of Appius' governorship, he and his legates went home with their pockets filled. And Cicero now arrived as governor. Cicero had actually managed to avoid being a governor ever since he'd been consul back in 63, but Pompey passed a bill to send out more governors because there was a shortage. So Cicero was pressed into service as governor in Cilicia, and when he arrived, he was absolutely appalled by how poorly Appius had run the province. However, at the time, because Cicero was a dedicated member of the Boni and was always hoping that the aristocrats would eventually accept him despite his plebeian birth, he didn't bring this up publicly to Appius' face, but he does write to his friends about just how awful Appius was as governor, and how much of a problem he created. For Cicero, however, this will create some opportunities, because his brother is a decent-ish general, and so Quintus Cicero was able to put down some local rebels, and this earned Cicero some military credibility that he had never had before. So if not for Appius' misgovernance, then Cicero would have never had his very brief moment in the sun as a triumphant military commander, by which I mean he was on horseback watching from afar while his brother led armies, and then the other legate did some stuff too. So Appius, in this way, indirectly helped Cicero, while also making the Republic look bad in the process. For me, I find the figures who switch sides to be the most interesting, and I find that when and why they switch sides is often the most intriguing question one can ask of any of these Roman senators. That's why I've always had a strong interest in people like the younger Curio. But Appius also has a major switch in his politics. So what exactly happened to make Appius make such a sudden and even violent change in his political stances? Well, a lot of it involves the downfall of his two brothers. In early 52, Publius was traveling along the Appian Way with a small following. He encountered a larger following under his great rival Titus Annius Milo. The two of them had fought a number of times before, and their followers truly hated each other. A scuffle broke out, and in it, Clodius was mortally wounded. After he passed, his followers took his body to Rome, and they burned the Senate house as a way to honor him, as a funeral pyre. This led to more political turmoil and a breakdown where the Senate allowed Pompey to be sole consul to restore order. In the meantime, Pompey passed legislation to allow for more prosecutions for electoral corruption. That old scandal involving Memmius was still hot at the time, and so this was a response to that as well. In order to allay public fury at the murder of Claudius, Pompey allowed his ally Titus Annius Milo to be prosecuted and exiled. And so, we have to think about what Appius came home to. By the way, one of the victims of this new legislation was actually the other brother, Gaius. But Gaius's political ambitions may well have been stillborn because he was not the most charismatic or interesting guy in the world, and also he, I guess, was not as important to Appius as Publius was, if we're being quite blunt about it. Publius was clearly the star of the two in Appius's eyes. So if we think about why Appius would have gone with Pompey, who only saved one of his two brothers, or saved the reputation of one brother and let the other one fall, I think the answer is pretty simple as to why Appius made his switch. He looked around at Roman politics at the time. He saw that Pompey and Caesar were about to split up, that their relationship was falling apart. Pompey had remarried after the death of Julia, and he had married the daughter of Metellus Scipio. In the meantime, Appius was probably thinking about which one he could cozy up to. Pompey was already an in-law, because Pompey's son was married to his daughter. Then if we think about who else Appius might be married to at the time, or who else he was related to by marriage, he had been slowly aligning his family with the Bani. So despite the fact that he had been an operative more or less of the First Triumvirate for years, he was steadily getting back into that conservative circle that he had started out in. One of his other daughters was now married to Marcus Junius Brutus, and in fact, she would show her devotion to him later in a famous anecdote that I'm sure we'll cover at some point. So anyway, I think a lot of Appius's change was due to who his allies were at that moment, and also maybe the presumption that Pompey's faction was now stronger. So because he had a stronger connection to the faction that he may have seen as stronger, the decision was easy. And not only would Appius jump into this new alliance with relish, but he would do so in a way that was deliciously hypocritical. When he returned from Cilicia, Appius Claudius Pulcher ran for and attained the office of censor. His colleague was Caesar's father-in-law, Calpurnius. This would be the final censorship of the Roman Republic, by the way. The office would not be held again until after Augustus had come to power. And so it was historically significant in of itself, but it also was highly significant for reshaping the politics going into the final crisis between Pompey and Caesar. Appius was very much the dominant figure among the two censors. In fact, he ran roughshod over Calpurnius at every turn, to the point where if 59 was the consulship of Julius and Caesar, then 50 was the censorship of Appius and Claudius. Appius went after everyone he didn't like while ignoring any abuses whatsoever by his own followers. If Calpurnius tried to retaliate by going after someone that Appius liked, someone who was among the Bani, Appius would effectively defend them, while continuing to go after members of the Populares faction. So, Appius suddenly started acting like Cato the Elder, and much like Cato the Elder, he was a rank partisan. He would accuse people of all kinds of offenses that were obscure, so his knowledge of religion was now coming into relief and being used for his cause. And many of the accusations that he made may or may not have been true, but almost all of them were amazingly hypocritical, since he himself so famously had engaged in corrupt practices in the past and had violated every known luxury law as well over the course of his life. So Appius was acting in a purely partisan fashion, and in many ways his censorship was nothing more than a witch hunt against members of the opposite party. The result of this is that a lot of people who supported Caesar were stripped of their office. They were booted from the Senate, and this would mean that when Caesar took over Rome in 49 after Pompey fled Italy, that he would have to reinstate a lot of people, and they would lose all of their seniority in the Senate. So in many ways, this would create a kind of personnel crisis for Caesar, or at least exacerbate it. However, at the same time, Appius's rank partisan application of the censorship also meant that a number of people who lost their office were bitter about Appius and his ally Pompey, and so their decision in the Civil War was made for them because they knew that Caesar would advance their interest and restore them. Whereas clearly, Appius, Pompey, and the rest were against them being senators. So perhaps Appius actually made a number of people join Caesar who otherwise would have stayed neutral or maybe even gone with Pompey to Greece. Who's to say if it was a successful move or not, actually? We don't know. Most likely it kind of broke even in the end. But still, this helped to drive up the tensions going into 49, since Appius was conducting a witch hunt, and tensions were already high enough after the election was decided, and it turned out that both consuls for the year 49 would be adamant opponents of Caesar. Perhaps this was the thing that tipped the balance. It's hard to say, but possible. If we look at the debate in December of 50 and January of 49, there were compromise proposals on the table. In fact, the most famous one was by Curio the Younger. And when it was put to a vote, the Senate showed that all but around 15 or 20 people were in favor of avoiding war with Caesar and coming to some sort of a negotiated settlement. Appius was very firmly among the Warhawks, along with Lentulus Crus, one of the consuls, and a number of others. And it was this little group, this little core of Warhawks who ultimately were able to steer the Senate to war. Ultimately, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it should come as no surprise that Appius Claudius Pulcher was with him from the outset. He went to Brundisium, and from there into Epirus and Greece. Pompey had a problem that was the opposite of Caesar's problem. Caesar had a problem in that his army had very few senior magistrates to hold the most senior commands and offices back in Rome. Pompey had plenty of senior guys, but not a lot of people who could serve in more humble capacities. And so he had to accommodate a number of egos, because he had a number of ex-consuls who expected to get commands worthy of their dignity. Among the biggest egos in that army was Appius Claudius Pulcher. Not only had he done Pompey a whole lot of services in terms of driving the tension for war and voting reliably to make sure that the war happened, but he also was an in-law. And so Pompey had to make sure he had a command. Therefore, Pompey gave him perhaps the most important governorship in the area, aside from Macedonia, and that governorship was Achaea, or more or less southern and central Greece. Here, he'd be responsible for raising troops, supplies, and money to help out Pompey. Pompey's army as a whole was being assembled in Epirus and Macedonia in the expectation that Caesar would be coming from the north. And so Appius, in many ways, was sort of commanding, I guess, what we might call the secondary theater. And he would be reinforcing and supplying Pompey. So he'd be setting up supply lines, bringing in reinforcements, making sure that Caesar's agents in Greece didn't have a good time recruiting. So it was an important task, and certainly worthy of his dignity. We don't know, of course, what he thought of it. Perhaps he thought that he should be in Macedonia proper. But we'll never know, because he never told us, and as it turns out, this would not prove to be a very long governorship. As we mentioned earlier, one of the things that Appius was known for was his avid interest in all things religious. He was someone who believed in all superstition, especially Roman, but just like most Romans of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, he was legitimately obsessed with all things Greek. And so for him, things like the Pythian Oracle were immensely fascinating. In fact, throughout his life, he had made trips to Greece in order to visit various shrines and learn as much as possible about things such as the Eleusinian mysteries. Now that he was governor in Achaea, he had a lot of leisure to travel about and visit these sites while his legates helped to organize things. And so he made a trip to the Pythian Oracle. He decided that he needed to learn more about how this war with Caesar was going to go. So he went to the oracle and asked for a reading. the oracle replied in a way that was not terribly kind. It told him that the war was no concern of his, as he would soon lie dead in Euboea. Euboea was in his province. This was an island just off the coast of Attica. And apparently Appius, despite his piety, did not take this particular message from the god Apollo that seriously. In fact, he soon went to Euboea in order to help gather money and supplies. And almost as soon as he arrived on the island, he suddenly fell ill and died. So the oracle, at least if the story is to be believed, was true. In other words, Appius Claudius Pulcher, the mostly superstitious man who believes just about every oracle, turned out to be correct about the oracles. Also, much to his delight, and I say that sarcastically, had he lived longer, he would have found out that his position in the College of Augurs was filled by a loyal Caesarian, Publius Vatinius, a man who suffered from scrofula, which is an ailment of the skin. And a lot of ancients believed that any kind of ailment that was inborn rather than inflicted over time was a punishment from the gods. So one has to imagine that Appius may have rolled over in his grave, believing that someone who was not beloved by the gods was now interpreting the signs from the gods. Of course, he, as the most pious and patrician man to ever live, had failed to heed the Pythia, so I'm sure Vatinius couldn't do that much worse. Upon his death, Appius Claudius Pulcher was succeeded by his nephew Gaius. So Gaius Claudius Pulcher, the son of the other Gaius Claudius Pulcher, became Appius Claudius Pulcher and carried on the tradition of having the name most associated with arrogance. That being said, the Appius Claudius Pulcher, who was consul in 54 and censor in 50, is actually the best attested of any of the many, many men who held that name. And a lot of that is simply the accident of when he happened to live, and that he happened to be a contemporary of Cicero, who wrote so many letters with personal observations about his contemporaries. If you'll recall, Appius left a rather strong impression upon Cicero because of his incredible arrogance, causing Cicero to actually invent a word to describe him, appietas, the regard for his Appiusness instead of for his ancestors. Well, he had plenty of regard for his ancestors, or for Rome as a whole, or for the gods, although he had plenty of regard for the gods too, just not as much as for himself. In fact, he was the kind of guy who would never admit the wrongdoing. Other people, like Gaius Memmius, might very well be corrupt, but he, despite having partaken in the same exact scandal, was Appius Claudius Pulcher. So it was different. Politically, in many ways, he's very similar to Metellus Scipio, a guy who very much touted his heritage and leaned upon that to an excessive degree. That being said, based on the evidence that we have, Appius was much smarter than Metellus Scipio. He was someone who was more opportunistic and had to actually create some of his luck early on when he joined the first Triumvirate. He then came back to Rome, reinvented himself completely, and was a leading member of the faction that had aligned itself with Pompey. In fact, he played a role perhaps in bringing Pompey over to their side against Caesar. So, Appius, if anything, is more or less just a more talented, more well-read version of Metellus Scipio, which is not something to be proud of, but it's still better than being Metellus Scipio. The other thing to keep in mind is that the biggest legacy that he had was not being the brother of one of the most famous women in Roman history, nor being the brother of the most famous troublemaker in Roman history, but perhaps his most important legacy was being one of the key drivers of the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. One of the guys who made sure that this easily avoidable conflict occurred, and that the Republic therefore fell. So Appius Claudius Pulcher, despite his appietas and his desire to see his family live on for many more centuries, as the most proud family in Rome, he did a whole lot to make sure that the republic that had sustained his family would not exist beyond his lifetime. And so, Appius Claudius Pulcher is an interesting fellow, but ultimately we can't really say that he was the kind of guy who made the world a better place. Of course, he would say that his very presence made it a better place, but this isn't his video, it's just about him, so he does not get the final word. I'll be covering more Romans from the late Republic, including his consular colleague Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who, as you probably guessed from the name, is in fact a direct ancestor of the Emperor Nero. So stay tuned for that and more. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.